Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's installment of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the Pop Conference. My name is Gus Stadler, and I co-organize the series along with Antonia Randolph, Elena Razlogova, Alex Visi, Eric Weisbard, and Carl Wilson, as well as Kimberly Mack and Francesca Royster, who are on sabbatical from their work with us right now. Please note that you can see all previous episodes of, is that the right word? I don't know. Uh, um, Episodes of this series on Eric Weisbard's YouTube channel. Next week, we have back-to-back weeks, which is not common these days. God, I'm going to mangle this name. Amy Sherzith will be talking about her book in progress, Sound Machines, Pop Music's Visible Past, with Catherine Provenzano. But today we're excited for a conversation, a three-way conversation about the performance of Bad Feelings by popular artists whose affectively charged music resonates with fans in nuanced ways, often bearing on questions of mental and emotional health. And I'll introduce our panelists. Dan DiPiero is a musician, writer, and teacher researching improvised and popular musics in the United States with a particular focus on affect and sentiment. His work includes Contingent Encounters, Improvisation in Music in Everyday Life, and Big Feelings, Queer and Feminist Indie Rock After Riot Girl, both books published by University of Michigan Press. The latter is due out in October. Dan currently serves as the secretary of IASPM US and runs a popular music studies newsletter called Crybaby. Jessica Holmes is associate professor of musicology at the University of Copenhagen. She's currently in residence as visiting professor at the Sorbonne University Institute of Epidemiology and Public Health through the 4EU Plus European University Alliance. Forthcoming with University of Michigan Press, her first book, Music at the Margins of Sense, analyzes deaf ontologies of sound and music. Her peer-reviewed articles on music, disability, and gender appear in the Journal of the American Musicological Society, the Journal of the Society for American Music, and the Journal of Popular Music Studies, among others. From June 26th to 27th, 2025, she'll be hosting an interdisciplinary research conference at the Sorbonne on depression in popular music. And then finally, Robin James is an editor and independent scholar. She's author of 5.5 books, including the forthcoming Good Vibes Only, Phenomenology, Algorithms, and the Politics of Legitimation from Duke, and an expanded second edition of her 2015 book, Resilience and Melancholy from Michigan. She's former co-editor of JPMS, and her work on gender, race, and the philosophy of music includes current projects on the relationship between alt-rock and the alt-right, and the history of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit. And with that, I will turn things over to our panel.
Great. Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. Since I don't have a book coming out, I'm kind of the conversant, discussant, MC, whatever. So what we're going to do, the plan is we'll just go alphabetically. Dan and then Jessica will give us a quick overview of their books, and then we'll spend about 30 minutes in a conversation among the three of us, and then we'll open it up to questions. Okay. Dan, did you want to get us started?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. It's like a real treat to do this. So I'm gonna throw my PowerPoint up here. Is that cool? Coming through? Okay, amazing. So yeah, I'm gonna read a little bit, talk a little bit. The first thing I want to say before I forget is the book is not due out until October, but there's like a Spotify playlist that's up on Michigan's website right now. If anybody is just like a screenshot, if anybody wants to listen along, it's like a pretty massive playlist, and I think I've decided to stop adding to it at this point, but it will orient you and give you a sense of the kind of bands that I'm talking about and the kind of approach to indie rock that they are taking. The other reason I wanted to just do a quick shout out to the Michigan website is because they've like very kindly given a pre-order discount code. So there it is. If anybody's interested in pre-ordering the book, you can use pre-orders 25 for 40% off, which is really cool. And I will drop the link to that in the chat. But while this obnoxious slide is still on everybody's screens, I will introduce the book for those of you who haven't heard me talk about it. The main point of this is to try to grapple in a serious way with the music that we might reasonably identify as part of the contemporary indie revival. A scene that started to pick up press attention, as far as I could tell, around 2017, when the New York Times first clumsily but notably dedicated a full multimedia package to the ostensible reemergence of women in rock. Of course, one reason I say notable is because when I started to research the book, it became clear almost immediately that the vast majority of extant writing on indie music of any kind, whether academic or journalistic, and however the given author understands the word indie, the writing proceeds from this common sense assumption that the music is pretty much made by and for white men, as if this were a truism. And of course, another reason that the Times package stands out is not necessarily for its progressive or interesting framing around questions of gender, but rather because it recuperates this very infamous women in rock trope that all of us talk about in our pop music classes, and which has this sort of exhausting history that places women outside of the genre of rock and causes us to pay special attention when they do pick up guitars. So the release of the Times package is notable for my project, not because I endorse its framing, but because even it signals that even mainstream press outlets are aware that something had started to shift around 2017. And also, I just wanted to pause and note this amazing slide, which captures two of the rock press's main tropes, rock is dead and women in rock, in a single framing. So even though the reasons that I think so are not the reasons that the Times think so, this press attention does signal that even mainstream news outlets are aware that something's happening. It's a shift that has seen women, transgender, nonconforming, and otherwise queer musicians, as I write about in the book, basically everybody but straight white guys, move to the front of the cultural conversation around rock music, notwithstanding the Atlantic's very recent resuscitation of yet another rock press trope, which is the indie boy genius. But we'll leave that aside. So in my book, I suggest that this wave of rock musicians does constitute an important intervention into indie history, not for the reasons that the Times suggests, reformulating, in fact, what rock music means and for whom, coalescing its affective energy in order to discuss the emotional worlds and social orientations of women and queer folks through the world-building power of shared languages, a power we can see in the signifiers that repeat across examples, including, for instance, the many songs about transit, the many songs that feature heavy usage of major 7 chords, particularly 1 to 4 progressions, as well as repeated references to pets, flowers, teeth, and invocations of figures recuperated as feminist icons, including Ophelia, Salome, Artemisia Gentileschi, and above all, perhaps, references to contemporary mysticism, particularly invocations of tarot and astrology, are ubiquitous, a kind of lingua franca for young feminists and queers that I see as a contemporary riff on the long-standing feminist embrace of witchcraft. Likewise, oblique or in some cases direct references to climate change as a kind of foregone conclusion or structuring condition in temporary life are very commonplace and help to contextualize the widespread feelings of anxiety and depression experienced by both practitioners and fans in the big feelings scene. So rather than talking about feminist political issues or naming queer desire as such, bands are more likely to use coded language to signal to listeners a vibrational space of common concern and similar social orientation, a general and extremely thin invitation to coalesce under shared sentiments about what matters in the world. So my book explores this kind of shared language with close reading and ethnographic interviews, probing how the music matters to people. Slightly less than case studies, it explores key thematics performed by bands like Land of Talk, Soccer Mommy, Indigo D'Souza, Mitski, J-Som, Sasami, The Ophelias, Vagabond, Boy Genius, and more. And throughout the argument that I present is that all of this music produces powerful queer feminist affects that draw in and foster certain political orientations, but that a critical aspect of this dynamic is that it happens indirectly, primarily through a focus on the ostensibly abstract and personal subject of feelings. So put another way, while it's easy to read this music as apolitical on the surface, listeners and musicians alike nevertheless recognize its affective pull, its capacity to foster community and consciousness around issues disproportionately affecting minoritized subjects, and the ways that musical affects perform the kind of social catharsis that writers like Sarah Ahmed, Lauren Berlant, and Anne Svetkovich have variously talked about as a kind of public feeling. So following this work suggests that part of the reason the music resonates in the ways that it does has to do with the social context in which it sounds, a political backdrop of normal, unceasing crisis for young people globally and in the US uniquely. Like feelings themselves, the issues with which this music grapples may be more easily felt than articulated. And that's pretty much all I have to say about that, except that this is the table of contents, and I'd be happy to dive in anywhere a little bit more specifically. Chapter 3 is Indigo D'Souza. Chapter 5 is the Ophelias. Those are the only ones that aren't labeled, but otherwise, that's the book.
Cool, thank you. Jessica, do you want to tell us about your book project?
Yes, thank you. Wonderful, Dan, and I will share my PowerPoint presentation now. All right. So I'm kind of between 3 languages at the moment. So I have scripted my presentation also to be as concise as possible. So here goes. In recent years, depression has become an undeniable focal point in Western popular music in several different ways, including as a term explicitly and loosely invoked by musicians and fans across diverse languages, often alongside the equally charged terms anxiety and trauma, to disclose, destigmatize, celebrate, glamorize, and/or normalize feelings of melancholy, loneliness, and despair. Depression is invoked as an explicit pretext for listening to popular music as a form of self-directed mood regulation, increasingly as an organizational theme on streaming platforms and video sharing apps in connection with mood and activity-based playlists, and also as a diverse stylistic mode with distinct musical and audiovisual markers associated with key musical personae and key subgenres, many of which are gendered and racially coded. So my book, The Musical Vernacular of Depression, endeavors to make sense of this richness and complexity in contemporary popular music relative to the widely documented rise of diagnostic rates of clinical depression in the West, particularly among young people, and especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and its associated gendered, racial, and class-bound inequalities. By framing depression as a dynamic, expressive language or aesthetic repertoire encompassing distinct semantic practices, stylistic conventions, and affective cultures, I argue that popular music is transforming the ways young people conceive of, communicate about, and tend to their mental health amid what the World Health Organization characterizes as a worldwide disparity of mental health care. Unequivocally, depression is a loaded term, and there is significant ambiguity and debate over what depression is in our present historical moment. The International Classification of Diseases and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental disorders define clinical depression or major depressive disorder as a common and serious mood disorder characterized by prolonged feelings of sadness, loneliness, inertia, despair, and a loss of interest and enjoyment in daily life. An experience that is often comorbid with, that is co-occurring with anxiety disorder, which is characterized by persistent excessive worry that interferes with daily activity. Yet the practice of naming and claiming depression, as in I am depressed, or I have depression, or my anxiety, something that is on full display in contemporary popular music, is unbounded by diagnosis and pathology in ways that engender cultural suspicion that depression is overstated or a luxury problem or a construction of the white elite, and a related concern among psychologists around self-diagnosis, the perils of self-diagnosis, and the false pathologization of ordinary emotional distress, and a disregard for professional diagnosis and treatment in the process. To that end, MAD studies scholars have sought to challenge the hegemony of the clinical model and the stigmatizing framing of depression as a disease or disorder of the mind or a biochemical imbalance of the brain by drawing attention to the sociocultural construction of mental illness writ large as a category of difference, recasting it as a source of identity and pride in the process. And this sociocultural perspective is echoed among affect and cultural theorists, many of which Dan mentioned, like Sarah Ahmed, the late Lauren Berlant, Anne Svetkovich, and the late Mark Fisher, who frame depression as a politically contingent experience that is symptomatic of the failures and inequalities of neoliberal capitalism. Following from this, I argue that the musical vernacular of depression blurs a clinical definition of depression with what I think of as a generational depathologization of depression and mental health more broadly. And I use the term vernacular here to signal ordinary, everyday means of expression as they are distinct from the specialist language of the medical establishment, to also signal the increasing everydayness of depression as a common mood disorder in accordance with its clinical definitions, and also its increasing normalcy in youth culture. And I propose that we can think of the musical vernacular of depression in relationship to what Carol Vernalis describes as the audiovisual swirl of our contemporary media landscape. And we can also think of it in line with Xian Nai's characterization of an aesthetic category as forming around objective styles with distinct formal and sensuous properties that can be commodified to communicate a distinct feeling or pleasure. So, as I have argued elsewhere in this article that I published that was published in JAMS in 2023, really serves as the springboard for this book project, that in Billie Eilish's creative output, we witness a coherent aestheticization of depression that's very much reflective of her social location as a white Gen Z woman and the privileges associated with her whiteness. So her introspective lyrics, her close mic'd whisper singing, her intimate atmospheric production, her preference, especially in the early stages of her career, for oversized clothing that obfuscates her form, her tendency to stare vacantly at the camera, the alienating imagery of her music videos where she is often depicted alone and at the mercy of dangerous forces beyond her control. All of these musical and visual devices create a sense of despair, of physical immobility, and suspended agency that fans readily associate with depression. Now, just briefly, as a complement and counterpoise to Eilish, London-born R&B singer, pianist, and producer Sampha Sisse is also known for foregrounding melancholy and depressive states in his music and visual imagery. Many critics and fans have suggested that his 2016 song Blood on Me and its music video depict a panic attack, a representation of the body's fight or flight response in a moment of crisis, what Sampha himself described as the worst dream I've ever had, me running away from deep fears in my psyche. So Sampha's use of the breath through heavy panting and other vocal techniques like stuttering and punctuated vocables, the dotted rhythms and the cowbells, the siren-like piano figuration, all of these musical elements convey a sense of urgency and desperation as Sampha lies hiding in the middle of a wheat field and later runs from a pack back of greyhounds, racially charged imagery that strongly indexes the canine terror and agrarian landscapes of chattel slavery, reinforced by the line, "I swear they smell the blood on me." Indeed, scholars have theorized about the psychological impact of racial marginalization and dispossession in the context of Black and Asian diasporas as a form of racial melancholia and racial grief that structures racial identity under white supremacy. And in many ways, Blood on Me invites a reading in line with Christina Sharp's characterization of Black expressive culture in her book In the Wake, where she writes, "Living in the wake, the unfolding aftermath of the transatlantic slave trade means living the history and present of terror. Living in and with terror, we become the carriers of terror, terror's embodiment, and the grounds of terror's possibility globally." So in Blood on Me, Sampha arguably musicalizes and visualizes the terror of what Sharp calls the impossibility of Blackness, its abjection from the realm of the human as he runs for his life. Critics and listeners consistently remark that Sampha's music defies stereotypes of Black masculinity rooted in emotional and physical resilience, a formidability bias that results in a corresponding white disavowal and erasure of pain and depression and other mental illnesses in Black men, and an internalized shame around feelings of emotional distress. To that end, it's very interesting to note that Sampha's music is featured in Ryan Calais Cameron's critically acclaimed play for Black boys who have considered suicide when the hue gets too heavy, a work that speaks to the impact of racism on mental health and the perils and joys of Black masculinity and Black life in Britain, what is ultimately staged as a group therapy session between friends. So Billie Eilish and Sampha are but two from among a generation of popular musicians that are using their platforms and creative output to offer up words and descriptive terms, as well as musical and visual language for articulating and demystifying some of these experiences, diversifying the cultural representation of depression and anxiety in the process. And in these ways, the book proposes that we can think of the musical vernacular of depression as a creative site of medically unregulated public health discourse or depathologized public health discourse that newly equips people with the tools for conceptualizing, communicating about, and tending to their mental health in ways that have the potential to support human flourishing. So here I've included a table of contents, a tentative table of contents, because my book is very much in its nascent stages of development, unlike Dan's. And this is a bit of shameless self-promotion. At the end of June, in connection with my residency at the Sorbonne, I've organized and I'm hosting an interdisciplinary conference on depression and popular music, as Gus already mentioned. And so I would invite you to check out the tentative program, along with the presenter bios and the abstracts. And you will, of course, recognize many names and faces here. So that's all I've got.
Great, wonderful. Well, thank you both. I just want to say it was a real pleasure to read both of your projects and try to draw connections among them. And it was also just really interesting to see my own work reflected back to me in so many different ways throughout. And I really felt like an interlocutor with the project. So I just really appreciated that about both of your work. We're about 26 minutes in, so I'm going to kind of combine the first couple of things that we said we were going to talk about. So I asked Dan and Jessica to, maybe have a question for the other one, and they were both really about methods and artists. So I'm going to invite each of you to say more about methods and artists, but I also combine that with my question about method, because when I was trying to kind of think about how you were each individually, but also both maybe in a common way talking about feelings, I noticed you're really talking about sort of physiocognitive states that are not about propositional content. So I went like, is this phenomenology? Because that's how I was raised to understand what phenomenology was and what it was doing. And I know, Dan, Sarah Ahmed's work is really central to your project, and you're talking about like political orientations and kind of, there's this long discussion where you're like, is it affect? Is it emotion? Do we really have to care? And that, again, that just made me kind of wonder, maybe actually what we're talking about is, yes, all of these things, but maybe phenomenology is a a way to frame it that lets us sidestep some of those questions. So yeah, the broad method question. Dan, do you want to maybe go first and to give Jessica a bit of a break?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for doing this too, because I'm glad that it came across that you're an interlocutor in the book, because I just feel like that's exactly right. And I just think like yes, on the question of phenomenology, like this is something that I thought about a long time ago when I was reading Ordinary Affects, and just like this like pure mode of description where we're just in an experience that's unfolding. It does feel like phenomenology to me. And then of course Ahmed is so concerned with those same kinds of questions. So I think if there's a difference, it's a matter of like what traditionally phenomenology got performed in order to answer. So you know, hinted at this with the question of consciousness. Like I don't think affect theory is necessarily deployed all the time to get at the ontology of consciousness, right? But so it's after answering different kinds of questions, but I think in the process, there's a ton of overlap in terms of what it's doing by describing the unfolding of something where you're tied together with other people and other objects in a room. Um, I think that the reason that I get into the weeds with affect, like, is it affect, is it feeling, is it vibe, is because there's subjectivity is important, and adopting a kind of explicitly fan-oriented perspective is really important. So like um in as much as I was dipping my toe into ethnography, I was doing so in a rigorously loose way where I'm like trying to inhabit the experience that a fan is having at a show, or even just like chatting with me on the sidewalk about this music. And that affect felt like a more useful way to try to stitch together what's happening there, because we were vibing on the same things, which is easier to talk about with affect and its loose terminology than phenomenological language. But at base, like, yes, I agree that they're doing really similar kinds of work. And I guess that gets at the other part of my answer, which is just that, yeah, I was part of the productive imprecision of affect, I felt required younger people to sort of like verify that I was reading things in a way that made sense. Not to just say like, yes, you're correct on your interpretation of this music, but to say like, no, I felt that too. So that's where the ethnography came in and felt really important, was like, I just want to yeah, have a conversation about the thing that we're both feeling in this space. And I think the selective interviews that I was able to do for the book helped me get there and put things in words that I would have never been able to come up with on my own.
Cool. Thanks. Jessica?
Yeah, I have a few different things I'd like to say in addition to all the wonderful things Dan has already said, which I very much concur with. I am thinking about the relationship between feeling, affect, and emotion in much the same way that Anne Svetkovich is when she talks about this sort of and I quote, intentionally imprecise retaining of the ambiguity between feeling as embodied sensation and feeling as psychic or cognitive experience. It also has a vernacular quality that lends itself to exploring feelings as something we come to know through experience and popular usage. And that's from Depression of Public Feeling, page 4. So the musical vernacular of depression really mobilizes, as I see it, this kind of open-ended, fluid approach to affect, or the slippage between affect, emotion, and feeling, serving as a sort of everyday aesthetic vocabulary through which to articulate and ultimately make sense of one's mental health. At the same time, however, I distinguish between feeling, or maintain rather, that depression is often more than simply a feeling or a set of feelings, but also a clinical experience. So the musical vernacular of depression is very much attentive to and inclusive of clinical understandings of depression. depression and anxiety as they are articulated in the side disciplines. There are many people for whom they experience depression as a biochemical imbalance of the brain or as a disorder of the mind. There are many people for whom a diagnosis can be an empowering and an invaluable tool for self-discovery and healing. And it's not something that people have equal access to, even in instances where diagnosis is sought. So even as I recognize that there is no culturally universal pathology of depression, I still maintain that clinical understandings of depression are useful. Regarding your question about phenomenology, I also want to add that insofar as the musical vernacular of depression accounts for depression as a socially inequitable phenomenon through its attention to things like gender, sexuality, race, and class. It's also attentive to the significant experiential overlap, and this is where phenomenology comes in, between depression and disability or impairment. So this is very clear from the World Health Organization's statement that depression is a leading cause of disability worldwide. And while that statement has been rightfully criticized by disability study scholars for reinforcing some of the stigma associated with disability, it nevertheless speaks to the lived experience of depression as a disability of a kind, or the disabling impact of depression. And so in thinking about how the musical vernacular of depression relates to phenomenology and how it might challenge certain naturalized assumptions or understandings of phenomenology in a universal horizon of experience, I'm very much indebted to the work of my late PhD supervisor, mentor, and dear friend, Jonathan Stern, who wrote in Diminished Faculties, quote, "A political phenomenology of impairment is therefore phenomenology minus one, minus unity, minus wholeness, minus quietude, minus a stable beginning. It must be founded on ambiguities, contradictions, fragments, webs, a subject who is somewhere and someplace, unsure of itself, a subject that oscillates between self-assertion and self-abrogation, between a gentle audacity and claiming its radical dependency and situatedness." I also want to mention in response that many disability studies scholars have talked about how disability collapses the divisions between consciousness, affect, and embodiment, or the physical and metaphysical realms, vis-a-vis Eli Clare's concept of the body-mind. So all that to say, I think there's a way in which the musical vernacular of depression speaks to and instrumentalizes this continuum that you referenced, Robin.
Yeah, thanks. And I think one thing that stood out to me, Jessica, as someone who's not a disability studies scholar but has done some of the reading, was the way that you're sort of using musical experience as a way to kind of trouble some of those sometimes posited as hard distinctions between like the medical model and the social model of disability, and really just kind of focused on the lived experience of depression. So yeah, that was one of my sort of takeaways from it as someone not deep in the disability studies literature. Um, Keeping on the theme of affect, one thing that I read in your materials, Jessica, was you used the language of affective culture throughout, and that, you know, if we're talking about affective cultures, this is popular music studies. We invented the theory of subcultures, you know. So I'm just kind of thinking about what kind of work is affective culture doing in both of your projects? And what does it mean that we're like, obviously Dick Hebdige is talking about subculture and the era of mass commodities, right? What does it mean that we're talking about affective culture in the era of platforms and, you know, mood playlists and psychometrics and things like that?
Shall I go first, Anne? I think I'm using the term affective cultures to refer to the listening practices and, yeah, the musical communities that form around the musical vernacular of depression. I think one very obvious example of this would be the phenomenon that is sad girl TikTok, or sad girl TikToks in the plural, insofar as the music of Boy Genius, Mitski, and a lot of the other artists that Dan's focusing on is being instrumentalized through viral hashtags like hashtag Mitski is therapy, and hashtag sad girl, not only as a form of mood regulation, but also, which is what I'm interested in, but also in service of the performance of a queer feminine identity and a sense of recognition and belonging within that community. So I talk a little bit about this in my chapter on the rise of sad girl music, but in that sense, sad girl TikTok is doing significant subcultural work as a kind of affective culture, and yet that, as I see it, and you're certainly pointing to this, that subcultural value is being commodified and simultaneously undermined by corporate entities like Spotify, in relationship to psychometrics and mood-based listening through, platform curated playlists like the Sad Girl Starter Pack, to cite one example.
Yeah, I'll just add a quick thought, which is, you know, the surge of work that's coming out showing the effects of, and I'm thinking of your work in particular, Robin, the effects of, Spotify's scrambled genre-less playlists. I feel I've been thinking about that recently as like reflective of a reality on the ground, actually, and not just something that manufactures a reality on the ground, although they're reciprocal, of course, which is that like these categories that organized people into subcultural cliques are less rigid now than they used to be, right? So I think the thing about affective culture for me is that it helps people find each other in the absence of such clearly defined boundaries. You don't, if, all the punks aren't necessarily hanging out all together because they're not necessarily dressing all the same way anymore, because they're not all necessarily listening to the same mixtapes anymore. And yet there's a certain like value system and sensibility that I think is shared among those kids. And to latch on to the same cultural thing can be the gateway into finding each other and then building out what could look like a pretty traditional subculture from our perspective.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because I think you're both kind of pointing to like, and I see this kind of in my own work and in contemporary popular music studies generally, but like the old categories that I learned about in the early 2000s reading like 90s popular music studies scholarship, like those don't really, technology has changed, the culture has changed. We need some kind of new conceptual frameworks to really grasp this moment properly. And I think this is one of the things that both of your projects is really helping us do, in a lot of ways. We just have a couple more minutes, so I'll do some quick questions. So Jessica's project is really clearly like the feelings are oriented in a particular direction, right? It's about depression. But Dan, when I was reading your project, I wondered, the qualifier in the title is bigness, right? So is it just the bigness in any direction that matters, or is there a particular valence or orientation, if you want to use like a Median language here? Yeah, does it matter what kind of feelings are big, or just that they are big?
Yeah, it doesn't matter for the conceptual thrust of the book at all what the content of the feelings happens to be. It does, if you look at indie rock as a slant, it does tend to skew negative because like the world, but within that, one of the things that I was really trying to resist is the temptation to just read this kind of stuff as sad, actually, because sad girl indie is so over associated with the type of indie music that I am trying to talk about, and sadness is a huge part of what's going on there, but it's not the only thing. So I take a lot of care to try to draw out moments of catharsis, moments of joy and recuperation. They feel hard won. They feel meek and even like tame. And in the Soccer Mommy chapter about affective feminism, I even talk about it as like a failure of a certain kind. We move from like Riot Girls political music to music that just sort of like feels political, and it could be seen as a kind of failure because those two things aren't the same. But nevertheless, it helps me make the argument that there is a full spectrum of emotional content that's being discussed, like super ordinary stuff, very tender stuff, lots of stuff about friendship and connection and community. That's all threaded throughout the sadness and the anger and the rage that you get with somebody like Wednesday and their single bull believer, which I talk about as just being like super aggressive. So yeah, bigness because it is at base a feminist recuperation of feeling as valuable and as worth growing an entire world around. Even the smallest little feeling is worth a song that fully probes that feeling. But there is a full spectrum going on, and it's really only like 1.5 chapters that focuses on negative affects in the book, although they're all over the place. You're still muted, Robin.
Sorry. One last question, kind of building off what Dan was saying, and this is for Jessica. Um, in philosophy, there's a whole literature about like, well, why do people like horror? Why do people like art that's about bad things? And so that made me wonder, what do people like about music that depicts, an aesthetic representation of what is otherwise a feeling that people typically do not enjoy experiencing? So yeah, what do people like in listening to this music?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do apologize. Somebody's running their laundry machine above me. It's late here in Paris. But so apologies if you can hear that in the background. In any case, yeah, I think that 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 the thing that fans appreciate is the sort of demystifying of a feeling, what originates as a feeling that they don't necessarily have words for, that they can't necessarily visualize. So this kind of clear, concrete, not always concrete, but representation visually and musically of something that's going on the inside. Billie Eilish is I think a poignant example to return to in the sense that fans describe the sound of her voice, her distinct vocal timbre and production, her whisper singing, not simply as an outward manifestation of this interior turmoil that they associate with depression and anxiety, but as an antidote to depression, that she is somehow soothing their anxieties and inner turmoil. And this is, I think, also further evident through the widespread comparison of the sounds and the physiological impact of her voice to those associated with ASMR. Now, Eilish's voice isn't exactly a horrific voice. It's a very quiet and pleasant voice. Although some people, I have a colleague at the University of Copenhagen, just anecdotally, for whom Eilish's voice, for some people, Eilish's voice is as polarizing as ASMR in terms of its physiological impact. I have a colleague who simply cannot tolerate the sound of Billie Eilish's voice. In any case, I think that sort of that example speaks to some of the payoffs involved in listening to music that foregrounds challenging feelings that aren't always pleasant. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, and you're both talking, I think, about like listeners connecting with music because it depicts feelings that they themselves take very seriously, I think, right? Yeah, and I guess to wrap up, one thing that I thought of in the course of this conversation that kind of crosses both projects, I think, is I was, you know, Gang of Four's Dave Allen died last week. Was that last week? And they have a song that's basically like, why are all pop songs about love? Right? And that, was obviously such a stereotype that in the late 70s they would say, like, you can write about other feelings, but we're definitely like, there's a much more expansive emotional or affective vocabulary now that you're pointing to in popular music. And I wonder, I don't know, we don't have to answer this because this is maybe a bigger question than I'm even capable of thinking through right now. But on the one side, we have analyses like where did sex go in popular culture? We have hot bodies but no sex. There was some article about film maybe a year or two ago, right? So that might be one end of the spectrum, right? These sort of like perfectly neoliberal bodies that are, personally responsibilized into hard abs and whatever, but yet no like tension release narrative cinema structure. But this might be the other end of that spectrum, right? Where we're sort of really digging into, like Dan, you even said the tiniest little feeling, right? Of, it could just be nostalgia, or I know you've been writing about the crush, or, things like that. So yeah, it's just striking me that I guess what you would call I'll call it the phenomenological, but you could call it the affective or the emotional, like the vocabulary of feelings that we see in popular music today is much expanded, perhaps in liberatory ways, perhaps in not so liberatory ways. But yeah, we are almost at 10 till. So I will just say, yeah, it's been wonderful to talk so far with you all, and we'll open it up to questions. Alex, were you going to field those?
Yeah, I've got you. We only have a couple of questions. Hopefully more people will come up with questions as they're sort of thinking through the remarks, but maybe we should start with Emily. Gail, she had a question about excess.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think this is a kind of follow-up to Robin's question for Dan about bigness and bigness of feelings. And so I've been thinking a lot about excess lately, and excess in terms of like charges of excess, accusations of excess, and how that in itself is gendered. And so I wondered if you're thinking about these ideas of bigness in feelings relative to questions of excess. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. That's a great question that I haven't thought about. I was actually thinking about it recently, because I'm writing about Sabrina Carpenter, or I'm trying to write about Sabrina Carpenter, and I was thinking about her shoes and her her glitter, and the way that like certain performances of femme identity capitalize on excess that is also always racialized, right? Um, because the capacity to sort of like perform excessive femininity is differently distributed, and the consequences for doing so are differently distributed. So it feels very easy for Carpenter to do that, because she's like, rich, hot, and white. But with this music, I'm not sure that excess factors into my thinking about it. I feel like bigness corresponding to intensity of feeling. So bigness meaning like a performance of affect, sound, vibration, corresponding to the intensity of the emotion that is felt, or the seriousness with which we want to consider this emotion. That feels like the more accurate frame. And nobody within that discourse is using the language of excess. I think I'm thinking through this in real time, so I'm not sure, but I think because excess implies that there's a boundary that's been transgressed, whereas like in the little community that's interested in exploring and probing these feelings, that's the whole point. So excess doesn't really factor into it. The one exception I might think about is Sasami. And when I talk about Sasami's performances of abjection and monstrous identity, the cover of her second album has like this demonic image on it. It's a traditional Japanese folkloric image of a woman demon with a snake body who like she's gorgeous down by the water, and then the men sailors come up to her and she turns into a snake and just like eats their heads. That feels like it's very intentionally tapping into a horror imagery, Japanese horror imagery, and performances of abjection centered around like the way Chris Stava talks about it, with like blood and feminized abjection in particular. And that does feel like it's deliberately crossing a boundary to say like, to advance a polemic that's like a big middle finger to all her haters, I guess. And that's the closest example that I can think of.
May I say something quickly as a follow-up to what Dan has said in response to Emily's question? Okay, great. That's a really great question, Emily. And I know it wasn't directed at me in my work, but I've certainly thought a little bit about excess in relationship to Billie Eilish's image and reception. In particular, this idea that even as women are at greater risk of developing depression, a risk that begins like in puberty and carries on through the life cycle. That teenage women's claims to depression are often subject to a scrutiny on the grounds that they are falsely pathologizing what are ultimately, or what is ultimately the sort of perennial, hormonally charged excessive displays of emotion, like symptomatic of a moody teenage girl on her period. So I've certainly thought a little bit about it. I haven't instrumentalized the language of excess, but when you asked about the sort of gender dimensions of excess in relationship to feeling, that was what came to mind.
Thanks.
Great. Our next question from Ben Tossig, wanting to sort of think through the sort of long history of Black popular music in relation to the modes of expression that y'all are engaging with. Is Ben still here?
Oh yeah, I'm here. I didn't know if you wanted me to like ask if to read my question or
Yeah, go for it.
okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about, how, um, it's of course often noted how popular music for many decades and more than a century has drawn on Black music in ways that are not always acknowledged, but often are kind of structurally or formally very apparent, or gesturally very apparent. And here, the discussion of emotional release in certain ways reminds me of what how we might summarize how Black music was emotionally expressive for a long time. And that might be this might be me misreading or overinterpreting or something. But I'm just curious if any of you would potentially draw that connection. If there's something to this moment of emotional release that we could connect to long histories of emotional release in Black music historically. Thank you.
Dan and I are looking at each other. Uh, I should say that Catherine Provenzano and I are brainstorming an article, a co-author piece on the legacy of whisper singing, because it's perceived as this sort of implicitly white genre of expression, a white feminine genre of expression, and we see that very clearly in Eilish's reception. But of course, there is this much longer racialized legacy of whisper singing that's often been erased and obscured. We haven't yet started writing the article, but it's something that we're thinking through together. I should also say that even through Billie Eilish's visual imagery, we see this appropriation of non-binary fashion or streetwear, hip hop streetwear, right? But it's been largely understood in her reception as transgressive on feminist grounds, right? So there, as you know, as you've so eloquently put it, there is this kind of erasure of Black the legacy of Black musical culture and sounding affect or expressing affect, whether through the music and also through different visual cultures as well. That wasn't a particularly coherent response, but I appreciate the question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm gonna possibly defer for the moment. I the way that I've been thinking about race as it factors into this phenomenon is like how contemporary indie rock builds its scenes today and what similar kinds of genre spaces it overlaps with and doesn't. Um, so insofar as this music represents a critique of the way that rock history has been told. I do think that there's a very intentional awareness on the part of a lot of these artists about the way that not just Black musicians, but other musicians of color and women have been written out of historical narratives. And that's why you see this pretty significant use of cover songs, for example, as like a critique about the rock canon. And so I'm thinking about that question less aesthetically in terms of a aesthetic lineage and more almost like demographically, just like making room at the table for different types of stories and different types of canons. And I think that most of the artists that I write about in this book, if not all of them, are actively engaged in doing that. And as a result, you can often see them playing in diverse bands and across diverse projects, meaning like they will trade musicians with each other, they will trade covers with each other. So I do sense awareness of the inadequacies and the overall whiteness of the indie space and efforts to combat it among at least this generation of players. Yeah.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Alex Reed, wanting to sort of get into the shaping of emotional complexity of our social understanding of depression over time. Hopefully I got your question right.
Yeah, can you all hear me? Am I coming through? All right, cool. Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in whether the approaches that Jessica and Dan are taking, like what that would look like if you had a time machine, you went back and you know, took the same approach in 1980, or like when Jimi Hendrix, and this is also kind of related to Ben's question, when Jimi Hendrix sings, manic depression, did he either mean, or was it either interpreted the same thing, in the same way that we talk about those things today? And I wonder, for that matter, are there inflection points where if you're like mapping out the histories of emotions, and let's say we're just taking depression as a case study, is there some breaking point where it's like, depression in 1890 was not what it is today, but in 1935 it was. Here's why, or something like that,
I'll just say a quick thing up front, if that's okay. I don't think it's the same. And I think what makes me say that most immediately is like the kind of low hum of chronic anxiety that Lauren Berlant talked about, the crisis ordinary, right? Like that showing up as depression, or anxiety getting talked about in tandem with depression as just like a baseline state. I think that has risen, right along parallel with neoliberal economic policies of the kind that get started in the late 1970s. So I think, yeah, there's a much more widely distributed experience of depression, even as I think probably there's a persistence of that 1970s interpretation and understanding of it, for people either of that generation or experiencing something that we could point to as being more clinical. But I don't have as much to say about that per se, but it's a great question.
I agree with everything that Dan has already said, and I don't know that I could put it any better myself. But I also think that it's different now, the degree to which it has entered the pop mainstream on a kind of unprecedented scale, this kind of deep mythologization of an otherwise deeply stigmatized experience that resided in musical subcultural spaces, I think is notable. And it again speaks to both the rise and the prevalence of depression among young people and people of all ages, frankly, and also the sort of the the cultural ease around talking about mental health, the awareness and the cultural ease around talking about mental health. But I think like mapping out the history of depression in popular music would be such an interesting and worthwhile project.
Next question. Gus, did you want to ask your question about sex or the lack of sex in some of this music?
Yes, I do. First of all, thank you, all three of you, so much for such a rich conversation. So yeah, this question came to me that I'd like to hear both of you talk about how your projects position sex and sexuality in relation to affect and affective cultures. And I think this is kind of bouncing off the last that last remark by Robin about the, no sex but hot bodies or whatever. But and also my own sort of sense that a lot of my students these are undergrads who listen to like, Boy Genius or whatever. I hope this doesn't sound like such a gross generalization, but anyway, that they associate sex with trauma at some level. And I guess I wonder if that's if well, I don't know how do you talk about sex in relation to bad feelings? It's like, I guess what it comes down to.
Do you want me to go first? Okay. Um, I think that's really interesting. And the place where I do feel like the indie rock that I'm talking about, because it explores a full spectrum of experience, has at least as much stuff that's about other things besides relationships as it does things about relationships. And within the things about relationships, because a lot of the music is coming from a queer perspective, there is a lot of like explorations of ambiguity, struggle, confusion, finding your way, at least as much of that as there is about sex. But I will say, like, where sex comes in, it feels like it is in the part of this music that overlaps with the emerging sapphic pop genre. Like there's like there's stuff about like hot women, you know, across these emerging discourses in a way that I think feels a little bit more unapologetic and full-throated. But the difference is like that kind of makes sense, right? Because when you say a lot of your students think about sex as being associated with traumatic experiences, like I'm wondering how much of that is like heterosexual sex, you know? So I see the sapphic pop phenomenon being the place where like people can get excited in a relatively safe environment and explore that feeling as one of many valid feelings that music is helping them to get through.
Yeah, and to add to the excellent things that Dan has already said, I think hyperpop is also a space where the connections between depression and sexuality are very well explored and well developed, particularly the trauma of gender dysphoria and transphobia, and the links between depression and gender identity. So that's certainly a micro genre, if you will, internet-based originally that I tried to tackle in the book. That's a really great question, though.
Can I just jump in here and kind of add maybe? Because I think part of what I was talking about when I was saying like the concepts that we got from like the 80s and 90s don't fit the situation anymore is there's the typical like love and theft dynamic where it's about white masculine subjects appropriating embodied receptivity from stereotypical black masculinity. Like I think that's not the structure of feeling in any of this. And I think that structure of feeling is sort of around, but that's not where the industry is not really focused on it. The main, none of the genres we're talking about are focused on it. So there's different structures of identification. And one of the things I've really been trying to think about is like, okay, so what's the new form of that, or what's in its place, right? And maybe I think some of what these projects are doing is showing what's in its place, right? We're not sort of like or for whatever reason, the focus is not on sort of masculine performance of masculine sexuality as rock has been, well, pop rock has been for so long, but there's identification at the level of um, other domains of interior life. I don't know what that means for sex because I think there is a really important point here to be like, okay, why do we not care about sex so much anymore, right? Like, there's a Foucault scholar probably writing about this. We said all we cared about was sex all the time, but now we don't seem to. Why? So, yeah, I think this brings up sort of broader questions for things like sexuality and queer studies as well.
And unfortunately, Barry, I don't see Barry Shank in the chat anymore, but he had a follow-up question about like cringe. And I don't know if cringiness like sort of is also something worth kind of unpacking here in relation to like kind of ambivalent feelings about sex or a lack of a need for sex or those kinds of things.
Oh, I wish I knew more about what he meant by that. But I love
What in the question you said, is this era of multiple depressions and big feelings a moment when desire feels wrong or feels cringy?
yeah. I would love more thoughts about this from other folks, but I appreciate the opportunity to say that for me, the bands that I'm writing about feel so beyond a concern about cringe. They feel like hyper earnest to me. Like I'm thinking about, so I have two screenshots of Instagram stories from Indigo D'Souza from a couple of years ago now, maybe 2023. But it could be today. It could have been like literally this afternoon, like when she gets on and explains what's been going on and the feelings that she has around community or relocation. I mean, her house was destroyed in Asheville right by the floods. And she's just narrating in a supremely earnest way, like this is what's going on with me, and you'll probably hear music about it soon, you know? So it feels like very divorced from this kind of online cringe discourse, for whatever that happens to be worth. It may be a part of the critique that the music is advancing, is like, be earnest.
We have two more questions left. I actually had a question, if it's okay to sort of tap in. I'm particularly curious about grief and like how, to what extent grief is like related but a separate thing, or like what do we do with grief? I'm thinking in particular with Jessica's example with Sampha in your sort of prepared remarks. I was thinking a lot about his song No One Knows Me Like the Piano in My Mother's Home, and like my way of understanding Sampha was like him sort of processing his mother's grief, which anecdotally I was going through at the same time when that album came out. And so I'm just kind of curious, like, what is grief doing, and is grief a different thing, or is it like, how do we untangle it, or do we need to untangle grief here?
Wow, that's such a wonderful question. I think it's difficult to disentangle grief from depression, or depression from grief. And you were absolutely right that a great deal of Sampha's music centers on having lost both of his parents in very close succession, and also his yearning to reconnect with his ancestral roots in Freetown, Sierra Leone, where his parents were born and lived before immigrating to the UK in the 1980s. So, but grief can certainly engender depressive feelings or depressive states. Grief can exacerbate underlying depression, so it becomes really difficult to distinguish between the two. And I think we can see certainly grief foregrounded in Sampha's music, but then the extent to which critics and fans have read his sort of musicalization of melancholy in his piano ballads. often, I think, speaks to the sort of cultural zeitgeist of depression. So perhaps what sort of begins as a kind of musical expression of grief develops a new meaning within the sort of popular discourse around Sampha, or is instrumentalized in service of this larger cultural discourse around depression. So I think, yeah, your question really speaks to the sort of ambiguity around what depression is and how we can begin to distinguish it from other negative emotions or experiences brought about by life's circumstances, like death, for instance. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
I don't know if I have a whole lot to add. I'm just picturing like a big wave. Like if depression is a wave, there are like acute experiences like grief, and there's the anxiety that attends everyday life. And I think it's all a spectrum of negative affectation that all of a sudden we have like music that is exploring a lot of that, you know? And one thing that kind of makes me wonder is like we don't have to get into this, but just in the back of my head I'm thinking about like the Samsel example in particular, like stages a kind of performance of anxiety in its musical dynamics. It's like acceleration of certain things. And Soccer Mummy does this too, right? She performs depressive hedonia with like a super, super flat affect in certain songs. And I'm wondering, like, is there room in the musical vernacular of depression for performances that are contradictory, where there's like that classic juxtaposition between really upbeat music and the subject matter is like super, super dark.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think hyperpop for
oh,
sure.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
hyperpop would
yeah.
be a really good example of that.
Cool,
Sorry,
cool, cool,
I got
cool. Yeah,
excited.
that's perfect. Yeah.
Last question comes from Elena Razalkova, wanting to sort of understand the connection between affect and generative music.
Do you want me to articulate it?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I'm walking, so I'm not gonna be on video, but basically I was thinking how there are two strands of conversations going on. One is about one that we hear today about different genres and trends in pop and indie music that focus on emotions, and another one critical of like generative AI or Spotify being organized around moods, and there the conversation is more about like pacifying or trying to people get over their feelings to be better workers, for example. That's one way of thinking about it. And I wonder if there's any relationship between this rise of mood music, which sometimes doesn't, like, the relationship of authorship and mood music is very different because a lot of these tracks don't have authors, they're anonymous, whereas the bands you guys are talking about and musicians are very much persons, and they present themselves as individuals. But then there may be some kind of connection via the rise of self-care culture, for example, or maybe there's no connection. So I'm interested how these two trends relate to each other, in your opinion. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you very much. I have just started to think about this, and I've been avoiding it, to be honest, because so I've been thinking about it through Lucy Dacus's new record. And one of the sentiments that was circulating online about that record is that it very much accords with a kind of like smooth, uninteresting background music that is palliative for listeners, and which connects deeply to another dynamic that I'm invested in, but like scared to think about, which is like the description from Mood Machine about like these jazz musicians who are taking these paychecks to make like elevator music. um so both things that I'm very invested in being reduced to the smallest parts of themselves. But I don't know, I'm not sure that I'm convinced that is an applicable framework for thinking about Lucy Dacus's record, and by extension, what's happening in the scene that she produces music in. I'm not sure about it, but like, in other words, I think it's a little bit too simple to say that because this is subdued music where people get really close to the microphone, that means it's functionally equivalent to music that was commissioned intentionally by a technology company to be as uninteresting as possible, right? I'm not sure that that seems like a fair equivalence to be drawn. I think if anything, the similarity there is that people crave sounds that are soothing. Uh, but that doesn't mean that all those types of sounds are the same, right? That's also the reason we enjoy going outside and listening to birds. That doesn't mean that this is all one part of the same large phenomenon.
Yeah, that was a fantastic question and a really fantastic response. I don't know that I have anything to add, but thank you.
I'll just pop in and say, like, if you look at the Spotify Lorem playlist, you can definitely see industry reasons why platforms are picking up on those sorts of songs, right? So it's in their, sort of communities of creation. They're not intended to function in this way, but capitalism sure loves that they can. So I think those tracks get elevated. I mean, in the same way that you saw alt rock radio in the 90s go bro, right? Because that accorded with the industry imperatives then. I think one of the things you're seeing is this music just happens to accord with things that Spotify wants to do. So it gets more likes and clicks and money and just more industry investment because of it. So at least that's kind of what I've seen, just kind of in looking at some of those mood playlists. And the Lorem one in particular is definitely geared towards women and leans a little more indie in a sense, as opposed to the Pollen playlist, which is sort of more trendy, includes a little more neo R&B, hip hop influenced stuff. So yeah, I would agree that I don't think the cause is the artist. I think it's just capitalism found something they liked.
Well, capitalism finding something it liked is a good note to end on. Thank you for this robust, generative conversation. Please join us again next Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Amy Schurseth is going to be talking with Catherine Provenzano about her forthcoming book, Sound Machines, Pop Music's Visible Past. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. Have a good night, everybody.